There it is right there, boom.
Sweet. I like to jig really most times of the year. I think spring starts out, you're fishing a lot of jig shallow fish, specifically walleyes, right? They're up in cabbage, they're up in some of the developing weeds. You're using lighter jigs. Even as they work out to the next break, you're just fishing a little bit heavier jigs quite often to keep up with them. And whether it's live bait and then eventually moving to plastics, jigs are a great way to just put baits in front of fish. And in the deep summer, and I don't use as many jigging techniques. I like pulling cranks, like pulling spinners, maybe even live bait rigging. If I do jig, it's a vertical presentation. We've got a small pot of fish, we drop it right on them. But then again, in the fall, jigging picks back up, right? Fish start moving to shallower structure. Putting the feed bags on, pitching jigs in plastic, specifically great big ones, is a super way to get bid. Yeah, you know, especially if you're fishing really visual jig presentations, I think of jigs and plastics as a very visual presentation. You're definitely going to be doing better in medium stained water trending clearer rather than medium stain or turbid water to extremely turbid or very dark water. I feel like those kinds of jigs and plastics are going to work better in slightly clearer environments than they are in the darker stuff. It's a real general rule. I think there's a live bait cadence and there's a plastics cadence. And the live bait cadence has a lot to do with just keeping your live bait on. If you're fishing a jig and shiners, you're trying to make sure that bait is being presented naturally, kind of moving in an undulating, just an overall more natural process and procedure as it moves its way across bottom. If you're starting to talk about jigs and plastics, I fish them faster for a couple of reasons. Number one, you can, right? You're not worried about them falling off your hook or being damaged and not having any bait. But the second reason is often if you don't have the real thing, visual enticement and speed, it's a triggering kind of thing. You're trying to trigger that bite, and really to get the max action out of plastics, I think moving it a little faster tends to work better. But there's also techniques that we use on the river, especially over clam beds or other hard bottom areas, where we'll drag jigs and literally let the current do what it's going to do as that bait is slowly dragging across the bottom or slightly above it, just ticking, where that's the order of the day. So I think that's maybe one of the beauties of jig fishing is there's so many different ways to do it. There's not a wrong way except the way that doesn't catch fish. Vertical jigging happens a lot when you're precision fishing over deeper water. You see fish on structure and they're potted up really tight. You got a decision to make when you see fish that are really clustered tight like that in schools. You could slip bobber on them. You could jigging wrap over those fish, especially if they looked active, or especially if you're targeting just the really big fish in the school only. But vertical jigging, just a jig and a minnow combination, jig and a leech, is really effective too, especially if you're trying to catch whatever is down there, whether it's eaters, whether it's bigger fish. I think it's a great technique when you're starting to talk over 20 feet of water and you see great big clusters or pods of walleyes. I think, why be fishing around them or pulling a rig all the way around them and trying to get them to chase when literally you could be right over the top of them. Man, there are so many jig styles out there. I can't say I religiously use every single one of them. I think there's a couple standouts that always, year in, year out, find their way into my box. Your average standard jig is great, especially if you're talking live bait, like a fireball with no collar, short shank. Works wonderful for just early season jig and minnow presentations. Also works in the summer if you're doing some vertical stuff right over the top of them. If you're fishing bigger minnows, the long shanked varieties always have those for chubs, shiners, whether you're folding it through the gill plate and out through the bottom of the minnow to get that hook back towards the back end of the bait, or whether you're kind of threading it, all of those situations call for a longer shank, so you don't just have fish grabbing the back end of the bait and not feeling the hook, right? The underspin varieties, I use a lot actually for pan fishing, trolling open water with jigs and plastics, and having that underspin, that enticement is a great way to get big crappies, especially trolling basins and out in open water. Stand-up jigs I tend not to use as much. Maybe rocky environments is when I use it the most. It's nice to get that bait to stand up and out of the rocks a little bit. I feel like they're slightly more weedless too for whatever reason. And then one that I use just a little bit is one with a weed guard. You know, especially in timber situations. It's not very common, but I have just a couple in my box for those reasons with a good guard in case I'm fishing really weeds with heavy stalks or wood environments. So those are the main ones that I like to fish and why. But I tell you what, every jig and jig design is meant to serve a purpose. And maybe the last one I'll say is anything with a good wire keeper. If you're fishing plastics, a wire keeper is just absolutely essential. So anytime I'm doing those kinds of jig and plastic presentations in the summer, I make sure that I've got that big, strong, aggressive keeper to make sure that, man, I don't pull the plastic down the bait a ways. I'm pretty simple when it comes to color, yet my main rule is contrasting colors. I don't like fishing all the same color. Like for instance, if I'm fishing a black plastic, I don't like using a black or a dark jig head. I like mixing and matching colors because I feel that contrast and seeing a darker bait up against a lighter jig head or a darker jig head up against a lighter bait is going to provide that contrast. And I think fish are going to be able to see it more easily. I know I can certainly see it in the water next to the boat much more easily. But when it comes to just standard colors and how I go, you know, if I'm fishing clear water situations, I tend to be more natural, more browns than blacks. Black is a great sleeper color for so many different things. Even in darker water, black is just a real winner, and on rivers. But for the most part, when I'm not fishing clear water situations or rivers and using, you know, those darker colors, I'm using the exact opposite. I'm using brighter colors. Again, this contrast idea. I'm fishing a lot of chartreuse. Red or orange has been really hot, especially, you know, we've talked at length over the years about rusty crayfish and kind of that effect, and jigs mimic rusty crayfish, which are everywhere now. So those orange, blaze orange, hot orange, lighter red colors are a go-to in those environments where rusties are in the water. So, you know, I'm kind of all over the board, but depending on the situation, in clear water specifically, I'll try to match the hatch, be a little more natural, but in other conditions and situations, I'm going bright, or I'm trying to match rusty crayfish patterns. For me, the simple rule of thumb is I fish the lightest jig that I can to mimic a really natural fall rate. However, I never let it get at the expense of being able to both feel the bait, being able to feel like I have control over the bait, and then also being able to feel the bottom. If I can't feel the bottom or feel like I don't have control over the bait, there's very few situations in which I'll fish a jig head that light. So depending on your environment, again, river currents, heavy current areas, that could be a half-ounce jig. In areas where it's dead calm and you're fishing shallow water, that could mean a 16th ounce jig. So every situation is different, and never be afraid to try and retie, You'll never know what a 16th ounce jig feels like in your given situation unless you actually tie one on and fish it. So again, I think at the beginning of your day, experimenting with either a couple rods rigged up with different sizes or just cutting and retying, it's going to lead to more fish getting that figured out. All great questions. If I'm fishing a heavy stained body water, I fish Pepin. It's not too far from home. Or river situations, I try to get away with a 10-pound braid. Usually I'm using you know, the Suffix 832. I like doing a direct tie. I feel like with a Palomar, you get a really strong knot. Yeah, and the sensitivity with braid is really unrivaled, so I love doing that. However, that Suffix Advanced, I'll use a lot of that in a 10-pound variety or 8-pound variety for walleyes and jigging in situations where I feel like it's a lot clearer and I need to be fishing something a little more translucent. But probably my biggest go-to for most situations is tying and fishing, you know, 10 or 15-pound 832 braid, and then I'll tie in a 3 to a 6 foot leader somewhere in there. Usually at the beginning of the day it starts a little longer, and as you clip it back and tying on different jigs, it gets shorter. But I use on that leader material fluorocarbon, usually 8 or 10 pound fluorocarbon, and tied in with an Albright special or whatever, you know, super line to fluoro knot that's your favorite. And that combination works just about anywhere and everywhere I've ever tried it. First off, if you're talking about fishing rods and rods in general, I think the extra fast action is probably the most key component to maybe even the entire jig fishing game. If you're fishing with a rod that's not stout enough to both provide backbone, but also sensitive enough at the tip to provide that perfect amount of give, you're not only going to lose bites, you're going to not detect the bites, but when you do get bit, you're going to not be able to get the backbone quick enough to set the hook, put a good hook on those fish and bring them to the boat. So I really think that your number one tip to being a better jig angler is finding a rod with an extra fast action that fits you and fits your budget, and it's going to help you out a lot. Now, when it comes to reels, reels are equally important, maybe not so much in the kind that you buy, but making sure that you reel, because when you're jig fishing and you set the hook, what I think a lot of people forget is with a rod that's stout enough, you're pulling the fish forward. So that fish moves forward. A lot of people, their next move is to bow the rod and reel. If you don't reel hard enough to pull that slack out of the line, you just move the fish forward and you've got a heavy jig. Jigs can either drop out of a fish's mouth or they can shake and get great leverage to work that hook loose. So many fish are moved on the initial hook set, and then because they're not following up with enough reeling on the way back to keep them buttoned, are lost. So those two things, a rod with an extra fast action and a reel, you know, even one that's high speed that allows you to pick up more line more quickly, those two things will help you catch so many more jig fish at the end of the day. Great question. I would definitely consider those the big four, so I think that's the right start. Minnows early, it's kind of a staple. It's just been around for a long time. It's kind of generally accepted practice. You're using bigger minnows at the outset of the year. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that leeches and bugs aren't quite as active then, but minnows definitely are, especially the bigger minnows from the prior year, right? We don't have a fresh spawn of minnows or bait in the system, so we've got a lot of these larger forage species, and whether they be shiners or chubs, whatever. Once we get into the season a little bit, I prefer leeches for a number of reasons. I think they're tougher. I think their natural ability to kind of weave and wrangle is really fishy. I think that makes them a great bait. I prefer crawlers over leeches when we've got bug hatches going on. Anything that's buggy or being closer to the bottom, I think crawlers are great, but more often than not, if I'm rigging or pulling spinners, I like having both out in those situations to check what the fish are going to be preferring from day in, day out. But plastics are probably my all-time favorite once we get past some of those initial early parts of the season. But for me, typically I'm using them on jigs. I will at times pull them on spinners, especially when perch or other small fish are just beating up crawlers. That's when it's nice to be able to go to an artificial crawler on a spinner rig or a spinner harness, but especially by the time we get to early midsummer and I'm fishing jigs, plastics, I'm using very little live bait at that point. Great question. The longer ringworm varieties earlier in the season, I don't know if it's force of habit, but that's just kind of what, growing up on the river, what I had always been doing. Fishing deep or fishing deep edges of things, kind of that smelt or split tail minnow kind of a profile has always been a great one, whether you're deep vertical jigging or in a river or whether you're off the edge of a weed line. Anytime I have depth involved, I love using that kind of just kind of split tail shiner or smelt looking profile. Curly tail grubs, kind of some of the bigger flap tails or things that have big aggressive movements to them, to me is a fall scenario. I use those in the fall a lot. I like big flop, big vibration, big color, big. That's really, to me, those plastic profiles are what I'm fishing, the majority of the time, especially once you figure in paddle tails. Again, that's another fall type scenario. I do use those in the summer quite a bit as well. So for me, those are really the big four once we go from ringworms to smelt, shiner, more natural, maybe a split tail variety of those, paddle tails mixed in, and then kind of the big curly tail grubs. Top 3 jigs to me would be that current cutter jig from Northland is a great one. It's got a great wire keeper on it. It's got a good profile that works both in lakes and also cuts current in rivers, which is nice because you can fish lighter weights and still get down to the bottom a little bit better. I think that's a top jig for me. The Fireball is a classic, been around for forever. If you're talking about live bait delivery, really it's the essential jig. More fish have been caught on that than just about any other jig around. I'd add maybe a third to that as a varietal, that long shank. I think early season especially, people miss a ton of walleyes because those fish are short striking, they're not super active or aggressive. They eat the back of these minnows and they just don't ever get a hook in them. So unless you're running a stinger, I know of no other way to get hooks into those fish and catch them and bring them to the boat. I think when it comes to fishing lakes versus rivers with jigs, rivers are a little trickier situation if for nothing else but because there's current, right? But whether you're lake fishing or river fishing, there's a couple things that can be really key tips, I think, to any angler. And the first is to make sure that you're not driving over the areas that you're jig fishing, especially if they're shallow, so staying back a little bit. And then line management and wind. Pitching either with the wind or against the wind such that you're perfectly parallel with it, whichever direction you choose. And that's going to prevent wind from putting a big bow in your line. And a bow in your line, especially with light jigs, is just a killer because even if you are getting bites, you're never going to detect them. Now when it comes to rivers, specifically in current like I was talking about, sometimes line type can play a big difference, and that's why it's always good to have one reel and one rod strung up mono. So I'll be having a mono rod and a braid rod, and a lot of times I'm pitching just like at a 45-degree up current, and I'm just kind of working that bait down. It's kind of bouncing along bottom. And depending on how the current is moving or the day or what the fish's preference is, sometimes that mono rod will definitely outproduce braid. And for whatever reason that is, it has to do with the bow and how the line is being caught in the current. You let the walleyes tell you what the right decision is there. I think definitely that bow in the line deal when we're talking wind, I think that's a primary one. Improper line management. If there is wind, I try and keep my rod tip as low as possible if I can't be parallel casting with the wind. And the other one is on the hook set itself. When they do detect a bite, I don't think most jig anglers, inexperienced ones anyway, I don't think most of them set the hook hard enough and then follow up with a continual reel to keep that fish buttoned up. So many fish are lost on that initial pull forward, drop the rod to get more reeling. Again, that's what we're kind of taught to do. We're taught to do this rod pumping thing where we pull hard and then we pump, and we pull hard and we pump. If you don't stay on that reel on a jig hook set, you can lose a lot of fish that way. So I think if you keep your line management figured out, keep the wind from blowing a big bow in there, and stay on the reel, you're going to put more jig fish in the boat. Yeah, I can think of the biggest one to me is jig trolling. I use jigs for panfish, and I've seen on a lot of different pieces, both online and TV now, guys are doing it with walleyes. It's been done for a while. It's by no means a new technique, but the cool thing about jig trolling is, especially if I think of it in a panfish situation like I do a fair amount, I can fish within the boat, depending on how many rods I've got or how many people in the boat. I can fish a 64th ounce jig, a 32nd, a 16th, an 8th. I can fish different plastics, and it's almost like a crankbait spread at that point. You're pulling along at a consistent speed, but depending on the weight, you're doing it at different depths. And it's a really easy switch to change your depth of pull just by switching into higher jigs and higher weighted jigs. And what we'll see so often is towards dark, as fish move up in the water column, those lighter jigs start getting hit better and better. So I think jigs and trolling them is a really underrated way to catch panfish, cover a lot of water while doing it, and especially for crappies, allow you to catch more than you would probably just individually casting for them. You know, I think another thing to keep in mind is when you're jig fishing, often you're having great contact with bottom, and that can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing, right? You've got rocks, you've got wood, you've got your hook that keeps beating up against this stuff. And when you're jig fishing, it's always a good idea, again, because these can be finicky bites and you're trying to set the hook and maintain good pressure and all those things. If you have a dull hook, it's not going to help you out. So keep a file on hand, check your hooks from time to time, and just give it a light brush or two with the file, especially after maybe you just got snagged up. I think that's going to help keep your hook sharp and put more fish in the boat too.